In this episode, we turn to a part of risk management that makes the entire discipline stay alive after assessments, plans, and control decisions have already been made. Many new learners think the hardest part is identifying a risk for the first time, but organizations are usually damaged by what they stop watching, what they assume is still working, or what they believe without checking closely enough. That is why techniques for risk monitoring and validation matter so much for someone studying certified in risk and information systems control. See CRISC. Risk does not remain frozen after a meeting, an audit, or a control rollout. Business processes change, vendors change, staff changes, technology changes, and threat conditions change, which means the organization needs ways to keep seeing whether exposure is rising, falling, or shifting shape. For a beginner, the simplest way to understand this topic is to think of monitoring as staying aware of risk over time and validation as making sure the information and conclusions being used are trustworthy enough to guide real decisions. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Risk monitoring is the ongoing practice of watching important conditions, events, indicators, and control outcomes so the organization can detect change before that change turns into surprise or damage. Validation is the related practice of checking whether the evidence, assumptions, and conclusions behind that monitoring are accurate, complete enough, timely enough, and meaningful enough to support action. The two belong together because watching weak information is not true monitoring, and validating information that nobody uses to watch risk over time produces limited value. A beginner should picture them as two sides of the same discipline. Monitoring keeps the organization alert, while validation keeps the organization honest. Without monitoring, the organization drifts into blindness and discovers important problems late. Without validation, it may still produce reports and dashboards, but those outputs can become polished versions of misunderstanding. Mature risk work depends on both continuous awareness and disciplined verification, because leaders need to know not only what appears to be happening, but also whether that picture deserves confidence. One of the most important ideas in this topic is that risk monitoring is not a one-time review repeated occasionally for tradition. It is a living activity built on the recognition that risk conditions move even when nobody is formally reassessing them. A system that was secure enough 6 months ago may now support more sensitive data. A third party that once performed reliably may begin missing commitments. A control that looked effective during implementation may weaken as staff turnover increases or business pressure encourages shortcuts. Monitoring exists because the organization cannot rely forever on old conclusions in a changing environment. For new learners, this explains why mature organizations do not treat risk registers, assessment results, and remediation plans as finished products that sit untouched until the next annual cycle. They revisit important conditions, track signs of change, and compare present reality to prior assumptions. Good monitoring shortens the time between a problem developing and leaders noticing it, which often makes the difference between manageable disruption and expensive surprise. Before an organization can monitor risk well, it has to decide what deserves close attention. That may sound obvious, but many weak programs either try to watch everything equally or focus mostly on what is easy to count rather than what matters most. Strong monitoring begins with prioritization. Critical business processes, highly sensitive data, important vendors, known control weaknesses, recurring incidents, major changes, and areas with high residual risk usually deserve more attention than low-impact environments with stable conditions. This is where business context becomes essential. Monitoring should follow significance, not just convenience. For a beginner, a helpful way to think about scope is to ask where failure would hurt the most, where conditions are changing quickly, and where leadership would most regret having poor visibility. When those questions guide the monitoring effort, the organization is more likely to focus on the signals that actually help decision-making instead of drowning in a sea of low-value metrics that look busy but tell very little about real exposure. The techniques used for monitoring often begin with gathering information from multiple sources rather than trusting a single report or team to show the whole picture. Useful sources may include incident records, access reviews, vulnerability findings, change activity, vendor performance updates, exception logs, audit observations, control testing results, recovery exercises, and operational reports from the teams closest to the work. Each source reveals only part of the story, which is why strong monitoring depends on bringing those pieces together thoughtfully. Beginners should notice that risk often becomes most visible when different forms of evidence start pointing in the same direction. Repeated late reviews, rising exceptions, missed service targets, and staff complaints may together reveal a process under strain long before a headline incident occurs. Good monitoring techniques therefore combine breadth with relevance. They do not gather information simply because it exists. They gather evidence that can illuminate whether risk is staying within acceptable bounds, moving toward a threshold, or changing in ways that require attention before the organization is forced into reactive decision-making. Trend analysis is one of the most useful monitoring techniques because risk rarely announces itself in a single dramatic moment. More often, it shows up as a pattern that becomes obvious only when the organization compares data across time. A rising number of overdue remediations, repeated access exceptions in the same business unit, increasing downtime for a critical service, or slower closure of important issues may all signal a weakening environment. Looking at a single month or one isolated event may not reveal much, but examining direction over time gives leaders a better sense of whether the organization is improving, deteriorating, or simply cycling through the same unresolved problems. For beginners, trend analysis is valuable because it turns scattered facts into something more understandable. It helps answer whether a problem is isolated or systemic and whether corrective action is having the intended effect. Monitoring becomes much more meaningful when it pays attention not just to the current number on a report, but to the story that number tells when placed beside prior periods and changing business conditions. Thresholds and triggers are another important technique because organizations need to know when a changing condition should move from routine observation into active concern. A threshold is a defined point at which attention, escalation, or action becomes necessary, such as when a certain percentage of critical systems remain overdue for review, when too many exceptions accumulate in one area, or when vendor performance drops below an agreed level for a sustained period. Triggers help make monitoring actionable. Without them, reports may show deterioration for months, while everyone waits for someone else to decide the trend is serious enough to matter. For beginners, this concept is useful because it connects monitoring to governance rather than treating it as passive observation. The organization is not just collecting indicators to admire them. It is establishing lines that help people recognize when risk may be moving outside acceptable levels. Strong thresholds are thoughtful rather than arbitrary. They reflect business importance, operational tolerance, and the likely consequences of waiting too long before escalating or responding. Not all effective monitoring is numerical. Qualitative techniques are often just as important because many risk changes first appear through conversation, observation, or professional judgment before they are reflected clearly in formal data. Walkthroughs of business processes can reveal where staff are relying on manual workarounds, skipping review steps, or compensating for fragile systems in ways that increase exposure. Interviews with process owners can uncover concerns about workload, dependencies, skill gaps, or third-party performance that have not yet become visible in dashboards. Governance meetings can reveal repeated delays, tension between control requirements and business pressure, or emerging technology use that policy has not caught up with. For beginners, this matters because it prevents an overly mechanical view of monitoring. Organizations are run by people, and people often notice strain before systems record it neatly. Strong monitoring, therefore, combines formal indicators with informed human observation, allowing the organization to pick up weak signals early instead of waiting for every concern to become a measurable event. Another vital technique is separating the monitoring of control activity from the monitoring of risk outcomes, because the two are connected but not identical. A control may appear active because reviews are being completed, approvals are being recorded, or reports are being generated on schedule. Yet the risk itself may still be increasing if the control is poorly designed, applied superficially, or no longer suited to the business environment. On the other hand, A low incident rate does not always mean the control environment is strong. It may mean the organization has been fortunate, or it may mean visibility is weak and problems are going unreported. For beginners, this distinction is crucial. Monitoring control performance tells the organization whether expected safeguards are operating, while monitoring risk outcomes helps reveal whether those safeguards are actually influencing exposure in a meaningful way. Mature techniques watch both. They look at whether the activity happened and whether the business condition the activity was meant to protect is staying stable, improving, or quietly deteriorating despite appearances of compliance. Validation techniques are what keep monitoring from becoming a belief system. One of the simplest and strongest validation methods is evidence review, where the organization checks whether the records behind a reported conclusion truly support it. If a report says that quarterly reviews were completed, validation means looking at actual review records, completion dates, responsible names, and supporting actions rather than accepting the summary at face value. Reconciliation is another valuable technique, especially when information comes from multiple systems or teams. If one source shows a control population of 100 assets and another source shows 85, that difference needs to be understood before leaders rely on the resulting indicator. Sampling is also common, allowing reviewers to test selected examples closely enough to judge whether the broader conclusion appears trustworthy. For beginners, validation is easier to understand when seen as a series of reasoned challenges. The organization asks whether the data is real, whether it lines up across sources, whether the sample supports the claim being made, and whether the conclusion still makes sense when examined closely. Observation and reperformance can strengthen validation even more because they reduce the risk of trusting a process description that sounds better than the real workflow. Observation means watching how a task, review, or control activity is actually performed. Reperformance means independently repeating part of the activity or recalculating part of the result to see whether the same conclusion can be reached. These methods are especially helpful when the process depends on human judgment, manual coordination, or data handling steps that may be described accurately in policy, but inconsistently in practice. A beginner should see these techniques as ways of testing reality against narrative. A team may report that approvals are reviewed carefully, but observation may show the review is rushed and based on incomplete information. A dashboard may show that issues were closed on time, but reperformance may reveal the closure dates were recorded before remediation was truly complete. Validation becomes more credible when the organization is willing to look directly at how work occurs instead of relying only on summaries prepared after the fact. Independence and challenge are equally important because people naturally trust the processes they built and the information that supports their preferred view. A separate risk team, control function, compliance reviewer, or internal audit group may ask questions that the process owner no longer thinks to ask, helping the organization test whether reported improvement is genuine, whether exceptions are becoming normalized, and whether the evidence supporting important conclusions is as strong as everyone assumes it is. Escalation and response are part of strong monitoring techniques because visibility without action does not reduce risk. If indicators show worsening trends, if validation reveals weak evidence, or if thresholds are crossed repeatedly, the organization needs a way to move that information to the right decision-makers quickly enough for it to matter. This often means defined escalation paths, issue tracking, ownership assignment, and follow-up reporting so that identified concerns do not disappear into meeting notes or informal conversations. Beginners sometimes imagine monitoring as a quiet background activity, but in mature environments it is tied directly to decision-making. When a serious concern emerges, leaders may need to authorize added controls, accept temporary residual risk, change timelines, increase scrutiny, or revisit earlier assumptions about a process or third party. Strong monitoring techniques, therefore, include not just observation and validation, but also governance mechanisms that ensure what is observed leads to accountability, and that what is validated leads to informed response rather than passive acknowledgement. A simple example helps bring the topic together. Imagine an organization is trying to monitor risk around a critical customer service platform. Useful monitoring techniques might include trend analysis on service outages, review of access changes, tracking of unresolved high-priority issues, observation of incident handling, and regular discussions with the business owner about staffing pressure and vendor responsiveness. Thresholds might define when repeated downtime or overdue remediation requires escalation. Validation would involve checking that outage data is complete, reconciling system inventories used in reporting, sampling issue records to confirm they were truly resolved, and observing whether escalation steps are followed as described. If monitoring shows stability but validation reveals missing data from an important subsystem, the apparent health of the platform may need to be reconsidered. That example shows why these techniques belong together. Monitoring provides the ongoing picture, while validation tests whether the picture is accurate enough to trust. Without both, leaders may either miss a growing problem or feel reassured by information that never deserved confidence. As we close, the key lesson is that techniques for risk monitoring and validation help organizations stay aware of changing exposure and stay honest about the quality of the information they use to judge it. Monitoring watches conditions over time through trends, thresholds, qualitative observation, and connected evidence from multiple sources. Validation checks whether those observations are supported by reliable data, sound interpretation, and enough challenge to keep optimism or habit from distorting the view. CRISC expects you to understand that risk management does not end once a control is implemented or a treatment plan is approved. The environment keeps moving, which means the organization needs ways to keep learning, questioning, confirming, and responding. For a new learner, this topic becomes much easier once you think of it as ongoing disciplined awareness rather than a reporting ritual. Strong monitoring helps the organization notice change, and strong validation helps it trust what it notices. Together, they turn risk management from a periodic exercise into a living capability that can support better decisions under real-world conditions.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.